I want you to just close your eyes for a second, if you can, and just listen to the rhythm of your own body. Picture the sheer complexity of it. You have a heart that beats, what, roughly 100,000 times a day?
Something like that, yeah.
And it's pumping blood through 60,000 miles of vessels. You've got an immune system that is constantly on patrol, identifying threats, neutralizing them.
It's a constant microscopic war going on inside us just to stay alive.
Exactly. And you have reflexes that make you pull your hand away from a hot stove before your brain even really registers the pain. We are, in every single measurable biological sense, survival machines. We are engineered to persist.
It's the biological imperative. I mean, it's the most fundamental law of nature. Every line of code in our DNA is written with one express purpose: keep the organism alive long enough to reproduce.
And yet, and this is the paradox, isn't it? Here's the paradox. We are the only species on this entire planet that systematically organizes, funds, and executes the mass destruction of our own kind. We take that incredible survival machine and we throw it into a meat grinder that we built ourselves. We don't just fight, we wage war. And I mean war with a capital W. We build entire economies around it.
We build monuments to it. We study it.
It's the great contradiction of the human experience. We build these vast civilizations to shelter and protect life, to extend our lifespans, and then we use the full industrial and intellectual weight of those same civilizations to snuff life out.
So that's the big question.
That is the question that's been keeping me up at night, and that's what we're unpacking today.
Yeah.
Is war a bug in the system? Is it a glitch in our programming? Or, and this is the terrifying part, is war the programming itself?
It's a question that has occupied generals, philosophers, scientists, really, since the first time a human picked up a rock in anger. But for today's deep dive, we're not looking at a specific battle.
Yeah.
We aren't going to debate the geopolitics of World War I or the strategy of the Battle of Hastings.
No, we're going much deeper. We're doing an anatomy of war. We're stripping away the uniforms, the treaties, the history books to look at the biology, the sociology, and the psychology of why humans fight.
We're trying to look at the machinery under the hood.
Yes. And to do that, we've got a really diverse and, I think, fascinating stack of sources.
We do. First, we've got a theoretical paper from the Small Wars Journal that makes this startling link between natural selection, lion prides, and modern insurgency.
Which is an analogy I'm still trying to wrap my head around, but you're right, it makes a scary amount of sense when you get into it.
Then we also have historical documents from Teach Democracy about the Gilded Age and this thing called social Darwinism, which really explores what happens when you take the laws of the jungle and try to apply them to, say, the stock market.
Right. And then finally, the heavy hitter for today. It's a massive, really comprehensive report from the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. And this report just digs deep into the psychology of the soldier. Why do they break the rules? Why do atrocities happen? And maybe most surprisingly, why is it actually incredibly difficult to get a human being to kill someone?
That was the aha moment for me in the reading. It really was.
Easy.
We have this assumption that we're a bloodthirsty species, but the data just suggests something completely different. That despite our history, the vast majority of humans have a biological hard stop against killing.
We literally have to be brainwashed to bypass it.
We do. And that tension, that specific tension between the biological drive to compete and the biological revulsion to killing, that's where we're going to spend our time today.
Okay, so let's start at the very bottom, the biological foundation. If we're going to understand war, we have to talk about evolution.
We absolutely have to. And for that, we need to look at that paper from the Small Wars Journal. The author proposes something he calls the nature of war theory.
Okay.
Now, usually when people study war, they quote Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general.
Right. War is the continuation of politics by other means. It's the famous line.
Precisely. Clausewitz saw war as a rational tool. You use it like a scalpel or a sledgehammer to achieve a political goal. It's an instrument. But this theory from the Small Wars Journal argues that war is much, much deeper than politics.
Deeper how?
It argues that war is a series of violent adaptive behaviors that are rooted in natural selection.
Violent adaptive behaviors. Okay, that sounds like a very academic way of saying fighting to survive.
It is, but the nuance here is really vital. The author uses an analogy that I think clarifies this perfectly. He compares human conflict to the behavior of a lion pride.
Okay, let's unpack the lion, because when I think survival of the fittest and lions, my mind immediately goes to, the big male lion fighting another male for dominance, the individual.
And that's the first level. You're absolutely right. Survival of the fittest at the individual level. If you're a lion, you need to be strong, you need to be fast, aggressive. If you hunt better, you eat better, you survive, you pass on your genes. That's standard evolution 101. But lions, just like humans, are social animals. They don't live in a vacuum, they live in prides. So there's a second level of evolution happening at the same time, survival of the group.
So the pride itself is the organism that's trying to survive.
Correct. Prides fight other prides. They fight for territory, for hunting grounds, for access to water. If your pride is weak, it doesn't matter how strong you are as an individual lion, you lose your territory, your pride starves, and your genetic line ends.
Okay, so the team has to be strong. That makes sense.
But here's where the problem comes in. The author calls it the sedentary paradox.
Right, this is where it gets really interesting. Because defending the pride, that's not a safe job.
It is incredibly dangerous. I mean, think about it. Defending the territory means fighting off invaders, other lions who are just as strong and desperate as you are. It means a high rate of injury and a high rate of death. So, logically, from a purely selfish individual perspective, what's the smartest move for a male lion?
To be lazy.
Would be lazy.
It's the free rider problem.
Exactly. You let the other guys go out and fight the intruders, you stay back, you stay safe, you eat the gazelle they caught, and you mate with the females while the quote-unquote heroes are out there dying on the perimeter.
So if natural selection only worked on the individual level, the gene for bravery would be wiped out almost immediately.
Instantly. The brave lions would die, and the lazy, sedentary lions would be the ones to survive and reproduce.
So eventually you'd have a pride made up entirely of cowards.
You would have a pride of sedentary, lazy lions. And what happens when a rival pride one that isn't full of cowards shows up on their border?
They get wiped out, annihilated.
The lazy pride goes extinct. So the argument here is that war, or, intergroup conflict, it acts as a check on that sedentary behavior. War weeds out the groups that have become too soft, too individualistic.
So war forces the group to adapt. It forces the group to maintain a class of individuals who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the tribe.
Yes, that's the theory.
That is a really dark thought. You're saying war is basically a quality control filter. That without war, a species becomes too sedentary to survive in the long run.
From a purely evolutionary biology perspective, yes. The theory suggests that extended peace might actually be dangerous for the long-term fitness of a group.
How so?
Because it allows that sedentary or selfish gene to proliferate without consequence. The author is arguing that war is the engine that keeps the group competitive and cohesive.
And he splits this into two different types of war, right? Which I found was a really helpful distinction for looking at, modern history.
Yes. He breaks it down into individualistic war and altruistic war.
Individualistic war seems pretty straightforward. That's the selfish lion we were just talking about.
It is. Individualistic war is rooted in self-interest. Think of a dictator or a regime fighting to protect its own power and its own wealth. It benefits a small portion of the group, usually the leadership, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the whole species or the nation.
And the source aligns this with the traditional view of war, with Clausewitz. War as policy.
Exactly. It's a transaction, a tool for personal or state gain.
Okay. But then there's altruistic war. And that sounds like a contradiction in terms. Usually we think of altruism as helping people, not shooting them.
Well, in evolutionary terms, altruism just means sacrificing yourself for the benefit of the group. So this is the revolutionary, this is the insurgent, this is the soldier jumping on a grenade to save his buddies.
Evolution is a team sport.
That's the quote from the paper. Altruistic war is rooted in group survival. The source actually uses the Arab Spring as a case study for this.
Oh, interesting. How so?
The author argues that what you saw there was essentially a tug of war between these two evolutionary behaviors. The regime, the government, was fighting an individualistic war to hold on to its power and resources.
Right.
The protesters, on the other hand, were fighting an altruistic war. They were risking their individual lives to ensure the future survival and well-being of the larger group, of the nation.
It really reframes how you look at the news, doesn't it? It stops being just distinct political events and becomes this this ancient biological algorithm playing out over and over again.
Selfish adaptation versus group adaptation.
And it suggests that as long as we're a social species that needs to compete for resources, that drive for violent adaptation, is just baked into our DNA. We are the descendants of the tribes that were willing to fight.
That's the sobering takeaway.
It is a sobering thought to start with. But stick with us, because it gets even more complicated when we move from the savannah to the city. We didn't stay in the pride, we built industrial societies.
And in the 19th century, we saw a fascinating, and you could argue a horrific, misappropriation of these biological rules and applied them to the economy.
We are entering the Gilded Age, and to do that, we have to talk about a guy named Herbert Spencer.
We do. Now, if I were to ask you who coined the phrase survival of the fittest, you would probably say Charles Darwin.
I absolutely will say Charles Darwin, 100%. It's intimately linked to the theory of evolution in my mind.
And you would be wrong. It was Herbert Spencer, a British philosopher, and he coined it in 1852.
Wait, 1852? That's 7 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species.
That's right. Spencer came up with the catchphrase before the science was even out there.
So what was he basing it on?
Spencer was looking at society, not just biology. He believed that society evolves just like an organism. He looked around at the brutal poverty of Victorian England, and he looked at the rising wealth of the industrialists, and he decided this was just nature at work.
Okay.
He believed the fittest, who he defined as the industrious, the wealthy, the smart, they should rise, and the unfit, the lazy, the poor, the slow, they should be allowed to die out.
Allowed to die out. That is incredibly harsh.
It was the core of social Darwinism, even though he started it before Darwin. And this philosophy, it took hold in America like wildfire during the late 1800s. It became the intellectual and moral justification for laissez-faire capitalism.
This is the era of the robber barons, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt.
Exactly, and they loved Spencer. They absolutely loved him because Spencer's philosophy told them that their massive wealth wasn't just luck or greed or exploitation.
No, it was nature.
It was proof of their biological superiority. And conversely, the suffering of the poor and the tenements and the factories, that was just nature weeding out the weak. It was a good thing for the species.
So what did this look like in practice? Because our source from Teach Democracy lists some pretty specific things that Spencer was against.
It is quite the list. Spencer believed the government had only two legitimate jobs: defend the nation against invasion and protect citizens against crime. That's it. Everything else was over legislation.
Okay, so things like welfare, aid to the poor.
Absolutely not. That just keeps the unfit alive artificially. It props up the weak.
What about public schools?
No. Why should the fit be taxed to pay for the education of the children of the unfit? If they can't afford it, that's nature's way.
Sanitation laws, public health regulation.
This is the one that really shocks modern listeners. Spencer actually wrote that diseases are one of the penalties that nature attaches to ignorance and imbecility, and they shouldn't be tampered with.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying he was against things like sewer systems because they saved too many of the wrong lives?
Essentially, yes. He believed that by helping the poor survive cholera or typhoid, you were weakening the entire species. You were stopping what he saw as a natural purification process.
That is just, it's incredibly ruthless.
Mm-hmm.
But this wasn't just some fringe philosophy, right? This had a real impact on the law.
It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The source details how the U.S. Supreme Court used this exact line of thinking to strike down labor laws. There was a famous case, Lochner v. New York, in 1905. The state of New York had tried to limit the work hours of bakers to 60 hours a week.
Which seems reasonable, given that working 80 or 90 hours a week in a hot, flour-filled room creates massive health problems.
Right. It was a public health law. But the Supreme Court struck it down, 5-4. They said it violated the liberty of contract.
The liberty of contract.
Their argument was basically, if a desperate worker wants to agree to work 100 hours a week for pennies, the government has no right to stop them. That's their freedom.
It's the freedom to either starve or work yourself to death. Those are your choices.
Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a famous dissent in that case, and he said, the 14th Amendment does not enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics. He was calling it out directly. He was saying the court was legislating this brutal survivalist philosophy into law.
It's so interesting to contrast this with the lions we were just talking about.
Yeah.
In the lion pride, the war, the conflict, is about the group surviving. The individual is supposed to sacrifice for the team. But in social Darwinism, it's the exact opposite.
That is a crucial distinction, and I'm glad you brought it up. In war, as we just discussed, the evolutionary drive is often altruistic dying for the tribe. In social Darwinism, the drive is hyper-individualistic. The strong individual crushes the weak members of their own tribe to rise to the top. It's a complete distortion of the biological principle of group survival.
And eventually, American society pushed back against this.
Yes, thankfully, the progressive era came along. People started to realize that a society where you let children work in mines and let the poor starve in the streets isn't actually advanced or fit. We decided that a society can choose its own future through regulation and social safety nets.
We don't have to be slaves to a biological metaphor that was flawed to begin with.
Exactly.
So, okay, we have the biological drive for war, and we have the sociological distortion of competition. But now we have to get to the really messy part, the individual human being holding the gun.
This is where we turn to that ICRC report, The Roots of Behavior in War. And this is where we run into a brick wall of psychology that complicates everything we've just said.
Because if we are these evolved killers from the lion pride, and if competition is the law of life, like Spencer said, you would think killing would come naturally to us.
You would think. You would absolutely think soldiers would be chomping at the bit. But the data says the polar opposite.
Let's talk about the World War II data. This is the statistic that always shocks people.
It's from Brigadier General S.L.A. Marshall and other follow-up studies. They looked at American infantrymen in World War II. These are men who were trained, equipped, fighting against the Nazis. A clear good versus evil fight, if there ever was one.
Right.
In close combat situations where they could actually see the enemy soldier they were supposed to be shooting at, what percentage of them do you think actually fired their weapons?
I'm guessing most people, if you ask them on the street, would say 80, 90%, maybe even 100.
And they would be way off. The number was 15 to 20%.
15%. So you're telling me that for every 100 soldiers on the front line, 85 of them were just not shooting.
They were busy doing other things. They were reloading, they were passing ammunition, they were shouting orders, or they were just keeping their heads down and hiding. But they could not bring themselves to pull the trigger on another visible human being.
Why? What was stopping them?
The report cites the work of Konrad Lorenz, a famous ethologist. He argued that, like many other social animals, humans have a deep, built-in inhibition against killing their own species. He called it a biological break.
A biological break.
Think of wolves. When two wolves fight for dominance, they growl and snap, and it's ferocious. But when one wolf realizes it has lost, it does something very specific. It bares its throat.
It exposes its jugular vein, the most vulnerable spot.
Yes. And the winning wolf at that moment cannot bite. It's physically incapable. The sight of that submission signal triggers a biological inhibition. The fight is over. Lorenz argued humans have a similar powerful break. When we see a human face up close, it triggers a deep-seated subconscious reluctance to destroy it.
Man is not a killer.
That's the quote. Man is not a killer, but the group is. And we'll get to the group in a minute. But first, the military had a huge problem. If only 15% of your soldiers are actually shooting, you are going to lose the war.
So they had to fix it.
They had to fix it, and they did. This is where behavioral engineering comes into the picture. By the time of the Vietnam War, the firing rate among U.S. soldiers was not 15% anymore.
What was it?
It was 90 to 95%.
Wow. How do you jump from 15% to 95% in a single generation?
Yes.
Did they breed more aggressive soldiers?
No, they just changed the training. It was a fundamental shift. In World War II, target practice was often shooting at a bullseye, a round circle on a piece of paper. You stand, you aim, you control your breathing, you squeeze the trigger. It was like a precision sport.
Okay.
But in combat, you don't see bullseyes, you see people. So there was a cognitive disconnect. The brain didn't recognize the target from training, and that gave the moral thinking part of the brain time to intervene and say, whoa, stop.
The biological break kicked in.
Right. So for Vietnam, they changed two key things. First, they replaced bullseyes with realistic, man-shaped silhouettes, pop-up targets that look like a person.
So you're training to shoot at a human shape.
Exactly. And second, they made the training all about reflex, not decision-making. Rapid-fire drills. You see a shape, you shoot. You don't think. It became what they call muscular memory.
So they were trying to bypass the conscious decision-making part of the brain entirely.
Precisely. They conditioned the soldiers using classic operant conditioning, basically Pavlovian techniques for humans. By the time a soldier was in the jungle in Vietnam, when a figure popped up from the bushes, they fired before they even consciously registered it was a human. The signal went from eye to hand, and it deliberately skipped the moral center of the brain.
That's terrifyingly effective. But you can't trick the brain forever, right? There has to be a cost to bypassing that fundamental biological break.
And the cost was massive. The ICRC report attributes the skyrocketing rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in Vietnam veterans compared to previous wars, partly to this new form of conditioning.
Because their bodies had been trained to do something and do it effectively, but their conscious minds were in full revolt against it later.
That's a perfect way to put it. When you strip away that natural inhibition to kill, you're stripping away a fundamental piece of the soldier's humanity. They come home, the combat reflex is still there, but the adrenaline is gone, and the moral weight of what they've done crashes down on them. They were successful soldiers by the numbers, but the psychological price was absolutely devastating for a whole generation.
The report also mentions something really uncomfortable here. It's not just about reluctance. It talks about eros and thanatos, kind of fascination with war.
Yeah, we have to be honest about this. As much as we are repulsed by war, there's a strange magnetism to it, especially for young men. The ICRC report quotes the philosopher Glenn Gray and others who talk about the delight in destruction.
The delight in destruction.
And the intense comradeship, a bond that you simply cannot find in civilian life. It's a powerful drug.
And the report links it to sex,
Yeah.
the life drive.
It does. It discusses the virility of war, weapons as phallic symbols, the heightening of all passions and senses. It says that in uniform, the eros, the Freudian life and sexual drive, is ramped up right alongside the thanatos, the death drive.
And that creates a confusing, intoxicating mix.
It does. It's not just horror. It's
Yeah.
also a high. It's the ultimate adrenaline rush. And that rush, combined with the reflex conditioning we just talked about, creates a very, very dangerous cocktail.
Which brings us to the next dark chapter then. If soldiers are naturally so reluctant to kill, why do we see so many atrocities? Why do we see torture, massacres, the breaking of all the rules of war?
Right. You'd think if people are hardwired not to kill, then war crimes would be a rare aberration. But the ICRC report has a whole section on the mechanism of atrocity, and it lays out why they happen.
So what are those mechanisms?
The first one is what we alluded to earlier, the group mind.
Man is not a killer, but the group is.
Exactly. Military training is fundamentally designed to break down your sense of individuality. You wear the same clothes, you get the same haircut, you march in sync, you stop being John Smith from Ohio, and you start being Private, a part of the unit.
So your loyalty shifts.
Your loyalty shifts from yourself to the group, and studies show soldiers fight not for an ideology, not for God and country mostly, but for the guy next to them in the foxhole. You don't want to let your squad down.
So if the squad is doing something terrible,
You do it too. To refuse would be a betrayal of the only family you have in that moment. The report also mentions the role of hazing and brutal initiation rites. We see this in the Russian army, for example, the concept of deduff China.
that's the brutal hazing of new recruits, right?
Yes. If a soldier is humiliated, beaten, and treated like an animal by his own superiors, he becomes desensitized to brutality. It normalizes it. So when he finally meets the enemy, he just projects all that abuse outward. He has been taught that power means inflicting pain.
It's a cycle of abuse that just keeps escalating.
It is. But there are other, more subtle mechanisms. One is distancing.
Okay, physical distance seems obvious.
It's the most straightforward one. It is much, much easier to drop a bomb from 30,000 feet than it is to stab someone with a knife. The pilot doesn't see the eyes of the victim, they just see a coordinate on a screen. Modern technology dramatically increases this distance.
But there's also emotional distance.
Yes. And this is the bureaucracy of killing.
This is the Hannah Arendt concept, isn't it? The banality of evil.
Exactly. The case of Adolf Eichmann. If my job is just to sign the paper that orders the train, and your job is just to drive the truck, and his job is just to load the weapon, and her job is just to pull a lever, who actually killed the person?
No one feels personally responsible.
No one. Everyone was just doing their small part of the job. Responsibility is diffused across the whole system.
But then you have the really active stuff, the hatred,
Yeah.
the demonization.
This is absolutely crucial. To bypass that biological break we talked about, you have to convince yourself that the thing you are killing isn't actually human. The report talks about intraspecific versus interspecific violence.
Killing your own species versus killing a different species.
Right. If I kill a human, that's murder, and my biology screams no. But if I kill a cockroach, that's just pest control. There's no moral dilemma.
So that's why you see all that propaganda calling the enemy vermin, rats, a disease.
Cockroaches was the term used constantly on the radio during the Rwandan genocide. Vermin was used by the Nazis to describe Jews. It's not just name-calling. It's a specific psychological tool to move the enemy from the human category to the animal or pest category. Once they're in that other category, the biological inhibition against killing them it disappears.
That makes a horrible kind of sense. But the report had one more mechanism that I hadn't really thought about before, and it's maybe the most disturbing one, the victim mentality.
This is, I think, the most dangerous one of all, because it disguises itself as virtue. The report highlights that very often the group committing the atrocities views themselves as the primary victim.
We are the ones who are fighting for our survival.
Exactly. The narrative is they want to destroy us, so we have to destroy them first. If you can convince yourself that you are the victim, you feel morally entitled to use any means necessary to survive. You feel justified in breaking the rules because, in your mind, the rules don't apply when you're facing extinction.
This is the ancestral victimhood idea. My grandfather was oppressed by your grandfather, so I'm justified in killing you and your children today.
We saw this with devastating effect in the Balkans. We see it in so many ethnic and religious conflicts. This narrative of we are the true victims acts as a total moral shield. It allows you to commit the most horrific atrocities while still feeling like you're the good guy.
That is a terrifying thought, that the person committing the war crime actually thinks they're the hero of their own story.
Almost always. Very few people wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to be the villain today. They say, I'm going to do what's necessary to save my people.
And this seems to bring us to the changing face of war itself. Because the rules we have, the Geneva Conventions, the laws of armed conflict, they were written for a certain type of war. But the report says we're in an era of new wars.
This is based on the analysis of a scholar named Mary Kaldor. Old wars, she argues, were state versus state. You had uniformed armies meeting on a battlefield. There was a front line. There were civilians safely back home. The goal was to capture territory or force the other army to surrender.
Think World War I, World War II, the classic model.
Right. But new wars are completely different. The actors aren't just states anymore. They're a messy mix of government forces, organized crime syndicates, private militias, local warlords.
And the goal isn't just about capturing territory.
No. The goal is often about identity politics, ethnic cleansing, religious purity. In old wars, you wanted to conquer the population so you could rule them and tax them. In new wars, you often want to get rid of the population entirely. You want to remove the other.
So in this new model, the civilian isn't just collateral damage anymore.
In many cases, the civilian is the target.
Wow.
Mass displacement, systemic rape, massacres of villages. These aren't unfortunate side effects of the war. They are the strategy of the war. If your strategic goal is to make a particular area ethnically pure, then terrorizing the civilians who live there until they flee is the mission.
And that completely breaks the whole concept of the civilian versus soldier distinction that all of our laws are based on.
It blurs it to the point of being meaningless. In these conflicts, your neighbor is the enemy. The distinction between a combatant and a non-combatant completely breaks down. And for humanitarian organizations like the ICRC, this is an absolute nightmare.
How do you enforce the rule, don't kill civilians, when the entire point of the war is to eliminate that specific group of civilians?
You can see the problem. It feels like the fundamental logic of warfare has shifted, but we are still trying to referee the game with the old rule book.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The space for humanitarian action, as they call it, is shrinking because the logic of these wars is total. It is identity-based, not ideology-based.
And that's a key point. You can change your ideology. You can't change your ethnicity or your perceived identity.
Okay, let's pivot to one last big psychological piece. Authority. We talked about the group, but we haven't talked about the leader. Why do we obey orders to do such terrible things?
Well, you can't talk about obedience without mentioning the Milgram experiment.
The classic shock test from the 60s.
Right. For anyone who doesn't know, a subject is brought into a lab and told by a scientist in a white coat to administer electric shocks to a stranger in another room every time they get a question wrong. The stranger screams, begs them to stop, talks about their heart condition.
And it's all fake, of course. It's an actor. But the subject doesn't know that.
They don't. And the scientist just calmly says, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue.
And what was so shocking was that normal, everyday people kept shocking them.
They did. To levels marked danger, severe shock. Milgram coined the term agentic state to describe what was happening. It's a psychological shift where a person stops seeing themselves as an autonomous individual who is responsible for their own actions.
And instead sees themselves as just an agent.
An instrument of the authority figure. They're just following orders. It's not just a legal defense used at Nuremberg. It's a real psychological state. You shed the burden of the decision. You hand your conscience over to the person in charge.
And the ICRC report links this to a slippery slope of justifying torture and atrocities.
Yeah.
It doesn't just happen all at once.
No, it happens in stages. The report outlines this progression beautifully. First, there's denial. We don't torture. Our country would never do that. Then there's minimization. Okay, maybe it happened, but it wasn't torture. It was just rough interrogation. Then comes justification. Well, it's effective. We need the intelligence to stop the ticking time bomb.
The ticking time bomb scenario.
Very always. It's the classic justification. And from there, you slide into moral disengagement. They did it to us first. Or, they're terrorists. They don't deserve human rights. By the time you get to the bottom of that slope, the entire society has been conditioned to accept the unacceptable.
The report mentions the family man executioner, the guy who goes to his job at the camp, tortures people all day, and then goes home and plays catch with his kids in the backyard. How does a human mind even do that?
Compartmentalization. He builds a wall in his mind. He believes he is doing a dirty, unpleasant job for the greater good. He convinces himself that his cruelty to the enemy is actually an act of love for his own family. He's protecting them from the vermin. It's a twisted, self-serving form of morality, but it's what allows him to sleep at night.
It's fascinating and just horrifying how flexible the human mind is. We can rationalize almost anything if we need to.
We are masters of justification.
So let's try to pull all these threads together. We started with a deep biological drive.
The lion pride. War as a mechanism for group survival, for keeping us competitive, for weeding out the sedentary and selfish traits.
Then we moved to the sociological distortion of that idea.
The Gilded Age. Taking survival of the fittest and twisting it to justify crushing the poor and the weak for individual personal gain. A war within the tribe.
And finally, we ended on the psychological reality on the ground.
That despite all of that evolutionary and social pressure, the individual human being is deeply, profoundly reluctant to kill another human being. We have to be tricked, conditioned, and distanced to do it.
We have to turn the enemy into vermin, we have to turn ourselves into agents of authority, and we have to convince ourselves that we are the real victors in the story.
It seems like war is this massive artificial construct built on top of a biological foundation, but it requires so much social and psychological engineering just to keep it running.
It does. It requires constant propaganda, brutal training, and nonstop psychological manipulation.
So here's where it gets really interesting for me, and this is the thought I want to leave everyone with. If we have to work this hard to get humans to kill each other, I mean, if we have to literally brainwash soldiers and demonize entire populations just to bypass our natural wiring,
then does that mean that peace is actually our natural state?
that's the provocative thought, isn't it? We always hear this mantra, war is human nature. But if war was purely human nature, we wouldn't need boot camp to break down our resistance to killing. We wouldn't get PTSD from the act of doing it. The very fact that war breaks our minds suggests that perhaps we aren't built for it nearly as much as we think we are.
But then you have these new wars, these identity conflicts. It feels like those are bypassing all the military conditioning, just tapping directly into something primal, that deep, ancient us versus them tribalism.
And that is the danger. That is the terrifying prospect. If we let identity politics completely override our sense of shared humanity, we don't need the elaborate military conditioning anymore. The hatred does the work for us.
It really is. So the next time you see a headline about a conflict or you watch a movie about war, I want you to ask yourself, what machinery is at work here? Is it biology? Is it sociology? Or is it just bad wiring that we haven't figured out how to fix yet?
And remember, understanding the anatomy of the machine is always the first step to dismantling it.
That is a perfect place to leave it. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Pleasure as always.
See you next time.